Sonoma Valley, California. The night air smells of crushed hydrangeas and betrayal. I am kneeling in the dirt, hands zip-tied behind my back, watching the red and blue police lights wash over the faces of the people who are supposed to love me. My name is Vivian Parker, and tonight wasn't a party, it was a trap. My mother is crying, but if you look closely, her eyes aren't sad. They are relieved. She thinks she has finally buried the family secret along with my reputation. But she forgot one thing: you can't trap someone who has stopped asking for permission to live. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. If you had told me 3 hours earlier that I'd be kneeling on crushed blue hydrangeas, hands zip-tied behind my back, watching EMTs pull my brother's fiancée out from under a collapsed tent frame, I'd have laughed in your face. I would have told you that my family was dysfunctional, sure, and that my parents were manipulative control freaks, absolutely, but I didn't think they were dangerous. But that's the thing about family: you think there are lines they won't cross because of blood, and you forget that for some people, blood is just another currency they can spend to save themselves. I watched the red and blue lights wash over the faces of the crowd, illuminating the donors, the lawyers, and the friends of the family, who looked at me with a mixture of horror and pity. But when Sheriff Dana Klein looked down at me and said those words, "Vivian Parker, you're under arrest," I didn't look at her. I looked past her shoulder at my mother. Celeste Parker was standing 10 feet away, clutching her pearls, tears streaming down her face in a perfect performance of maternal devastation. But as our eyes locked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. She didn't look broken. She exhaled. Her shoulders dropped. It wasn't grief. It was relief, like she had finally set down a heavy box she'd been carrying for years. To understand why I was in handcuffs at a vineyard estate, you have to understand who I am in the Parker family ecosystem. My name is Vivian Parker. I'm 28 and I have a reputation. If you ask the people I actually know, my landlord, my coworkers, my friend Noah, they'll tell you I'm sharp, capable, and hardworking. I left home at 19 because I realized early on that my parents' love was a transaction I couldn't afford. I built a life that wasn't glamorous. I worry about rent. I drive a sedan with a dent in the bumper, and my friendships aren't based on networking potential. But if you ask the people in my parents' tax bracket, they'll lower their voices and tell you that poor Vivian has always been difficult, unstable, impulsive. My crime in the family was always the same: I asked questions. And my parents, Richard and Celeste, learned a long time ago that they didn't need to beat me to win. They just needed to make everyone else think I was the problem. The setting for my destruction was a hyper-luxury engagement party for my brother Ethan and his fiancée Madeline. It was held at a private vineyard estate just outside of Sonoma, the kind of place where the valet line looks like a dealership for billionaires. The vibe was curated perfection, with imported flowers, a string quartet playing pop covers, and custom cocktails named after the couple. The guests were wealth-coded board members, old money couples with polite smiles and predatory eyes, and the local power players my father kept close. Ethan, my brother, is the golden boy. He's charming, conflict avoidant, and he loves me, but he loves the peace my parents buy him more. He invited me as a rare olive branch, and I accepted for 2 reasons. 1, I missed him. 2, I had found a clue 3 weeks ago. An old letter from a lawyer who claimed my grandmother's trust, which my parents said was empty, had actually been active for years. I suspected this lavish party was being funded by money that was supposed to be mine. When I pulled my car in between a Bentley and a vintage Porsche, the valet looked at me like I was a stain on a white tablecloth. I took a breath, smoothed my dress, and walked in. My mother found me first. She hugged me too tightly, her hands patting down my back and sides, less like an embrace, and more like she was checking for a wire or a weapon. She pulled back, smiling, that tight smile that never reached her eyes. She told me she was glad I came, but her eyes said otherwise. She told me to please just try to be normal tonight for Ethan's sake. People were watching us smiling like they were being kind, but I knew what they were thinking. There goes Vivian, the free spirit. She's doing better now, they say, while burying you alive with their pity. The tension wasn't loud, it was a low hum, a frequency only I seemed to hear. I went to get some air near the service entrance and bumped into Graham Pike, the estate's maintenance manager. Graham was a guy I'd known since high school. Blue-collar competent. The kind of guy who sees everything because rich people treat him like furniture. He looked nervous, wiping grease off his hands. He nodded at me and told me quietly to stay away from the vintage car. I asked him why, and he just muttered that there were issues with it. Issues he was told not to fix. It was a strange comment, but before I could press him, he walked away fast. A few minutes later, Marla Finch cornered me near the bar. Marla was an older woman who ran a small CPA practice and knew my grandmother. She grabbed my arm with a grip like iron and whispered that my grandmother didn't trust my parents. She said my grandmother trusted me, and I shouldn't let them rewrite that history. The centerpiece of the evening was supposed to be a surprise entrance. Ethan and Maddie were going to drive a restored 1960s convertible up the path to the tented dining area for a toast. It was Ethan's dream car restored at great expense. I stood near the back of the crowd holding a glass of water watching. The drone camera buzzed overhead, filming the spontaneous moment. Ethan was in the driver's seat, Maddie waving from the passenger side. The engine purred and they started rolling forward. It was slow, cinematic. And then the engine roared. It wasn't a gentle rev. It was a mechanical scream. The car didn't slow down as it approached the tent. It surged. I saw Ethan's face go white. I saw him stomping on the pedal, desperate. Nothing happened. Someone screamed for him to brake. The car swerved violently, missing the main crowd, but slamming specifically into the heavy timber support post of the dining tent. The sound was like a bomb going off. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. The corner of the heavy canvas roof collapsed, the timber beam coming down directly on the passenger side. Panic erupted. People were running. Dust was rising and Ethan's scream tore through the music. I ran toward them, instinct taking over. I was halfway to the car when a hand grabbed my shoulder hard. It was one of the groomsmen, a guy who worked for my dad. He shouted at me not to go over there. He yelled that he saw me. I tried to pull away, telling him I had first aid training, but he yelled louder for the crowd to hear that he saw me near the car earlier. He claimed Ethan asked me to get a gift from the table and I was messing with the wheel well. My mother appeared out of the chaos. She pointed a trembling finger at me and asked loudly why I would do this. She asked if I was that jealous. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. The crowd turned and the fear in their eyes shifted to accusation. The security footage, I would learn later, had malfunctioned at that exact moment. Sheriff Klein arrived fast, too fast, almost like she was already close. My father stepped in, then playing the role of the devastated patriarch. He offered to handle this privately, then pivoted loud enough for the sheriff to hear, saying that I had struggled with impulse control and clearly needed help. They found my fingerprints on a pair of wire cutters in the garage. I hadn't touched a tool in years, but I remembered my father asking me to hand him a specific wrench from his toolkit when I visited last week, a toolkit he must have brought here. It was a setup, a perfect airtight trap. As I knelt on the flowers, zip-tied and defeated, my father walked over to where the sheriff held me. He leaned in close, ostensibly to say goodbye, but really to deliver the final blow. He whispered so only I could hear. He told me to sign the papers they put in front of me to admit I was unstable and go to the facility. He told me if I didn't, I would lose everything I still thought I had. And in that moment, with the red and blue lights flashing against his calm face, I realized something ice cold. This wasn't an accident. This was a solution. They didn't just want me blamed. They needed me contained because the money they stole from me was the foundation under their entire life, and I was the one person who could prove it. So I stopped crying. I stopped trying to be believed. And I started building a case. I spent the night in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and old sweat, listening to strangers speculate about what kind of woman tries to kill her brother's fiancé. The rumor mill inside a county lockup travels faster than fiber optics. By dawn, I wasn't just a suspect, I was a monster who had snapped out of jealousy. The silence from the outside world was deafening. Ethan didn't show up. That silence cut deeper than the handcuffs. It told me he had already chosen his side, or that they had chosen it for him. When the heavy door finally clanked open the next morning, it wasn't to release me. It was for a visitation. My mother walked in first, looking absolutely destroyed. She was wearing muted colors, her hair slightly unkempt, a calculated performance of grief for the benefit of the guards and the cameras in the hallway. My father followed, flanked by a man I recognized as the family's longtime attorney, a shark named Sterling, whose loyalty was purchased by the billable hour. They sat across the metal table from me. My father placed a thick folder between us. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what happened. He just slid the folder forward. They offered to help. He said, his voice dripping with that reasonable paternal tone that used to make me doubt my own sanity. The deal was simple. I would sign an agreement acknowledging that I was suffering from a severe episode of emotional instability. I would consent to immediate inpatient care at a private facility of their choosing, a place where they could control who I spoke to and when I left. And the kicker, I would waive any future claims against the family trust or estate finances, handing over power of attorney to Richard Parker for my own protection. In exchange, they would make the criminal case go away. They had connections. They could frame it as a mental health crisis rather than attempted murder. It was a trap contract. Confess to being the problem, and they would save me from the prison they were currently building around me. I looked at the document. It was a confession of insanity and a surrender of rights all in one. I looked at my mother, who was dabbing dry eyes with a tissue. I stopped begging to be understood. I stopped trying to persuade my parents to love me correctly. I looked my father in the eye and said no. I told him I wouldn't sign a lie. And for a second the mask slipped. My father's face changed. It wasn't disappointment or worry. It was annoyance. Pure bureaucratic annoyance, like I was a lock that wouldn't open or a vending machine that had eaten his dollar. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He told me I was making a mistake that would cost me my life. But I knew the truth. Signing that paper would cost me my soul. I was arraigned and released on bail thanks to Noah Reyes, my one anchor in reality. Noah is a community legal aid investigator I've known for years, grounded, loyal, and allergic to the Parker family theatrics. He showed up with a public defender contact and a notebook, looking tired but determined. As we walked out of the station, the glare of the sun felt aggressive. I wasn't just fighting a legal battle, I was fighting a narrative. But I wasn't alone. Marla Finch, the CPA who had warned me at the party, called me within the hour. She offered to look into filings, tax records, and old foundation reports. Then Graham, the estate maintenance manager, sent a cryptic text through a burner app. The estate garage logbook had been altered before, and I needed to see it. A local bartender who worked the party reached out to Noah, claiming they remembered weird details about who was near the car and who argued before disappearing. The moral point was becoming clear. My parents had money, but I had people. The investigation began in my cramped living room, which we turned into a war room. We split the problem into 3 threads. Thread A was proving the accident was engineered. Noah connected me to a reputable mechanic who explained how brake tampering actually looks. He told me that if a line is cut, it sprays fluid immediately, but if it's scored and weakened, it fails under pressure, like during a sudden stop. That matched the accident perfectly. Vivian learns what evidence would exist if the line had been cut, versus if it failed naturally. Then Graham met us in a diner parking lot 2 towns over. He revealed that only a handful of people had access to the garage and the tools that weekend. One of them was my father's longtime operations guy, a fixer who did the dirty work the Parkers didn't want to touch. And the security footage, I learned that there were multiple cameras covering the main gate, the garage, and the tent area. Only the ones that could have cleared me had malfunctioned. That wasn't random bad luck. That was choreography. Thread B was finding the stolen money, the real motive behind the frame job. Marla dug into the grandmother's estate. She revealed that my grandmother had set up a trust with a third-party administrator on paper to keep it away from my father. But somehow, over the years, the Parkers had maneuvered themselves into control. I found out I should have been receiving annual statements since I was 21. They went to a P.O. box registered to my parents' address long after I moved out. My parents had told me the money was complicated, held for later, for my own good. In reality, it was being spent. Marla traced the spending patterns. It was funding Ethan's lifestyle, their social standing, and the substantial donations that bought them influence with the sheriff's office and local officials. They were living on the ghost of my inheritance. Thread C was the hardest, Ethan. I wanted him to be innocent because loving him was easier that way, but the evidence kept tapping me on the shoulder. We found a transfer memo that looked like it came from a trust distribution used to pay for part of the engagement party. Ethan claimed it was family money, and maybe he believed that. Maybe he didn't know it was stealing from his sister. Or maybe he didn't want to know. That ambiguity gnawed at me. Was he a victim of their lies too, or was he a beneficiary who looked the other way? As we started pulling on these threads, my parents tightened the noose. My father leaked a story to his friends in the community that I was dangerous and off my meds. I got a call from my boss. I was suspended indefinitely because of the bad press and the pending charges. Then a restraining order was floated for Maddie's protection, legally isolating me from key locations and witnesses. I started seeing the same black SUV parked down the street from my apartment. Then I came home one evening to find my front door unlocked. Nothing was stolen. My laptop was there. My jewelry was untouched. But a family photo of me and Ethan had been taken out of its frame and placed face down on the kitchen table. It wasn't a robbery. It was a message. We can reach you anywhere. I started to spiral. The gaslighting was working because it echoed the insecurities they had planted in me since childhood. I cycled between rage and grief. Rage was easier. It was fuel. Grief was the truth. The heavy, suffocating realization that my parents didn't just steal money, they stole the story of who I was. I doubted my own memory. Did I touch the car? Was I crazy? Noah had to talk me down, reminding me that guilt isn't proof you're wrong, it's proof you're human. The midpoint twist came when Marla found the smoking gun. It wasn't a bank statement, but an old legal document archived by a deceased attorney's firm she had connections with. It was a letter from the trustee dated years ago. It stated explicitly that my grandmother suspected Richard and Celeste would try to control me through money. The trust was designed to activate fully when I turned 25 regardless of my parents' wishes. I turned 25 3 years ago. The document showed a large distribution was made anyway, not to me, but to a shell entity controlled by Richard Parker. I wasn't too immature to receive my inheritance as they had claimed. I had been robbed, and now I was being framed because I had finally gotten close enough to the engagement party to potentially prove it. Armed with this, we needed one last piece of physical evidence to tie the sabotage to the family. Graham had told us about the garage logbook, the one they kept for insurance purposes. He managed to smuggle out the pages from the day of the party. We met late at night in Noah's office. The pages showed a tool sign out for the wire cutters. The signature belonged to my father's fixer, the man who shouldn't have been there. It was the proof we needed to show an external hand. But as I looked closer at the entry under the harsh fluorescent light of the desk lamp, I saw something else. Underneath the fixer's signature, there was a second line. It was faint, like it had been erased and written over, but the impression was still there in the paper grain. I traced it with my finger. It wasn't the fixer's handwriting. It was Ethan's. The stage for my resurrection was the same place where they had tried to bury me. 2 weeks after the crash, the Parker estate was lit up again, this time for a community benefit gala, ostensibly raising funds for local emergency services and dedicated to Maddie's recovery. It was the perfect theater, my parents surrounded by donors, the sheriff, and the media insulating themselves with good deeds, while the wreckage of my life was swept under the rug. They expected me to be hiding in my apartment, paralyzed by the shame of the pending charges and the restraining order rumors they had floated. They expected silence. What they didn't expect was for me to walk through the front doors of the ballroom wearing a dress I'd bought on credit, flanked by Noah Reyes and Marla Finch, holding a stack of bound documents like they were the tablets of the law. I walked into a room full of people who had already decided I was guilty. The conversation died instantly, rippling outward from the entrance until the only sound was the string quartet playing something inappropriately cheerful. They looked at me like I was a stain on white linen, a ghost crashing a wedding. I saw my mother across the room near the podium. She didn't look frightened. She looked at me with a small, controlled smile that I knew better than my own reflection. It was a look that said, "You just walked into your own execution." Beside her, my father stiffened his hand, going to the lapel of his tuxedo, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Ethan was the first to move. He looked pale, his arm in a sling, standing next to Maddie, who was seated in a wheelchair with her leg casted and elevated. Ethan rushed toward me, intercepting us before we could reach the center of the room. "Vivian," he hissed, his voice trembling. "What are you doing? You can't be here. Not tonight." "It has to be here, Ethan," I said, my voice steady, loud enough to carry over the hush. "This is where you all made me guilty. This is where I unmake it." "Please," he begged, glancing back at our parents. "Don't make a scene. He's barely holding it together." "I'm not here to make a scene," I said. "I'm here to make a statement." My father and mother descended on us, then a united front of concern and menace. Sheriff Klein was right behind them, her hand resting on her belt, looking pained. "Vivian," my father said, his voice projecting that calm, reasonable baritone that had fooled 1,000 boardrooms. "This is neither the time nor the place. We know you're struggling. We know you're not yourself." "She's off her medication," my mother added, pitching her voice to the nearest cluster of donors. "We just want her safe. Sheriff, please, for her own good." Sheriff Klein stepped forward, her eyes hard. "Vivian, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're trespassing." "I'm a shareholder," I said, my voice cutting through the curated atmosphere. "Marla." Marla Finch stepped up, opening the first folder. "As of this morning, Vivian has filed a claim asserting her rightful ownership of the trust that funds this estate. She has every right to be here." "That's nonsense," my father snapped, his smile slipping. "Sheriff, remove her." "I'm not leaving until everyone hears the truth about the accident," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I turned to the room, to the faces watching me with morbid curiosity. "You all think I cut the brakes on my brother's car because I'm jealous, because I'm unstable. But instability doesn't leave a paper trail. Fraud does." My father moved to grab my arm, but Noah stepped between us, massive and immovable. "Touch her, and we add assault to the list, Mr. Parker," Noah said calmly. I held up the first document. "This is an independent forensic report on the 1960 convertible. The brake line wasn't cut. It was scored with a file, weakening it so it would snap under sudden pressure, like a panic stop." I tossed the report onto a nearby cocktail table. "And this," I held up a second sheet, "is the security log for the estate cameras. You all saw the footage of the accident missing. A glitch, right? But the logs show the system was manually disabled 3 minutes before the crash and rebooted 4 minutes after. That's not a glitch, that's choreography." The room shifted. Not fully, they were still Parker loyalists, but the absolute certainty of my guilt cracked. People were looking at the papers. "Why would we do that?" my mother cried out, tears instantly filling her eyes. "Why would we hurt our own son? Because you didn't think he'd get hurt," I said, turning to her. "You thought the car would just roll into a flower bed, a scare, a reason to lock me away, but you messed up the physics." I turned back to the room. "And you needed a reason to lock me away because I found this." I signaled to Noah, who began handing out copies of the financial records to the sheriff and the few journalists in the back. "My grandmother left me a trust fund meant to be released when I turned 25. My parents told me it didn't exist, but these bank records show the money was distributed 3 years ago, not to me, but to a shell company controlled by Richard Parker." "Lies," my father roared, losing his composure for the first time. "She's forging documents." "It's not a forgery, Richard. Marla said, her voice sharp. I have the transfer numbers. That money paid for this estate renovation. It paid for your re-election donations, Sheriff. It paid for Ethan's startup capital. I looked at my brother. It paid for your life, Ethan. That money was meant to give me freedom. They stole it and turned it into my cage. Ethan looked at the papers Noah had shoved into his good hand. He looked at the numbers, then at our father. Dad, is this true? Don't listen to her, my father spat. She's sick. Then explain this, I said. I pulled out the garage logbook page the one Graham had stolen. I walked right up to Ethan. This is the sign-out sheet for the garage tools on the day of the party, the day the wire cutters were used. I pointed to the signature. That's Dad's fixer. He wasn't supposed to be here. Then I pointed to the line beneath it, the faint erased impression. And that's your handwriting, Ethan. Ethan stared at the page. I signed the log when I took the car out for the photo op earlier, he stammered. But why is it erased? Why is it written over? Because they needed to hide the timeline, I said softly. They needed the tools to be unaccounted for so they could plant them on me. You weren't in on it, Ethan, but you were used. You're not the golden child. You're just the distraction. Ethan looked up at me, and his eyes were wide, wet, and terrified. He looked at our father. You erased my name. You tampered with the evidence. I was protecting the family. Richard hissed, a confession disguised as a defense. No, I said. You were protecting yourself. The room was deadly silent now. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My father looked around, seeing his allies retreating, their eyes averting. He tried to pivot to find purchase. This is absurd. A few clerical errors. A misunderstanding. You're ruining your brother's engagement for this. Then a voice spoke from the wheelchair. Richard, Maddie said. Her voice was weak, but it carried. She wasn't looking at Ethan. She was looking at my father. Why would the cameras fail only then? My father turned to her, his smile twitching, trying to find the charm that usually worked on her. Maddie, sweetheart, technology is unreliable. We're looking into it. No, she interrupted. You said the security system was state-of-the-art. You bragged about it at dinner. Why did it fail only when the car crashed? Why did it fail only when Vivian was supposedly tampering with it? It was a coincidence, he stammered. He was too defensive, too smooth, and everyone heard it. I turned to Sheriff Klein. She was standing there trapped. On one side, the donors who funded her department. On the other, a room full of witnesses and a stack of evidence that pointed to conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Sheriff, I said, holding out a thick manila envelope, this is a formal complaint. It contains the mechanic's sworn affidavit, the forensic accounting of the theft, and the witness statements regarding the logbook tampering. My attorney has already filed a copy with the district attorney's office. Another copy is with the State Banking Commission. I paused, glancing at the journalist near the wall. And the third copy is going to the press. I pushed the envelope into her chest. She had to take it. This is how it works now, I told her. You can arrest them, or you can explain to the state investigators why you helped them frame an innocent woman. It's too expensive to ignore Dana. The sheriff looked at the envelope, then at Richard. The calculation in her eyes was visible. She took a step away from my father. Richard, the sheriff said, her voice official and cold. We need to talk, down at the station. You can't be serious, my mother shrieked, the tears real now, panic setting in. Dana, we're friends. But there's one last thing, Marla said. She stepped forward, holding a single sheet of paper. It was yellowed, enclosed in a protective plastic sleeve. Vivian's grandmother knew this would happen. She left a letter with her attorney to be opened only if the trust was contested. Marla began to read. Her voice shook with suppressed rage. I fear my son Richard and his wife will try to take what belongs to Vivian. They have always seen her independence as a threat. If they cannot control her with money, they will try to control her by calling her unstable. They will use her fire against her. If you are reading this, they have done exactly what I feared. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. That letter wasn't just evidence, it was prophecy. It proved that the Parkers didn't just react to a difficult daughter. They had been planning for me. They had been waiting for a reason to crush me since I was a child. Richard Parker slumped. The air went out of him. He looked old suddenly, defeated not by a fist but by the weight of his own architecture collapsing on top of him. Sheriff Klein gestured to her deputies. "Mr. Parker, Mrs. Parker, please come with us." They weren't in cuffs yet, but the walk to the door was worse. They were escorted out in disgrace, paraded past the people they had spent a lifetime impressing. My mother was sobbing loud, ugly sounds that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She couldn't cry her way out of the math. Ethan didn't move. He sat by Maddie's wheelchair, staring at the floor, holding the garage log with a trembling hand. Then he looked up at me. It wasn't a look of brotherly love exactly. It was shock. He was seeing me for the first time not as the screw-up sister, but as the only person in the room who had told him the truth. I watched the doors close behind my parents. I stood in the center of the crushed flowers and the shocked silence. I expected to feel triumph. I expected it to feel like fireworks, like a movie ending. But it didn't. My hands were shaking. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I looked at Noah, who gave me a small, grim nod. I looked at Marla, who was wiping her eyes. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that finally, for the first time in weeks, felt like it belonged to me. Winning didn't feel like joy. It felt like the sudden cessation of pain. It felt like finally being able to breathe. The aftermath of the gala wasn't the cinematic victory lap I had secretly hoped for. In the movies, the villain is exposed, the hero is cheered, and the credits roll over a happy montage. In real life, exposing your family's corruption is just the start of a much uglier, slower war. I wasn't instantly vindicated in everyone's mind. Oakhaven is a town built on old money and older alliances, and for many people, admitting my parents were monsters meant admitting they had been dining with monsters for decades. Pride is a powerful adhesive. It kept people stuck to the lie even when the truth was staring them in the face. The online gossip didn't stop. It just mutated. The forums and local Facebook groups spun a new narrative. I was a vindictive daughter who had staged the whole thing to extort money from my elderly parents. "Vivian Parker is a gold digger," one comment read. "She ruined her brother's life for a payout," read another. "The lie evolves. It always does." While the court of public opinion was hung jury, the actual courts were grinding into motion. The sheriff's department, humiliated by the public handoff of evidence, started an investigation that felt deliberately bureaucratic and sluggish. However, the district attorney's office was less hesitant. They began reviewing the financial crimes, fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. The most damning charge, however, was elder exploitation. Marla had found evidence that my parents had begun manipulating my grandmother's assets while she was in hospice care, a detail that turned the stomach of even the most hardened prosecutor. My parents didn't go down quietly. They were cornered animals, and they fought with the desperation of people who believe they are owed the world. They filed for a protective order against me, claiming I had threatened them at the gala. They accused Noah and Marla of criminal conspiracy, alleging we had hacked their accounts to forge the bank records. It was a last-gasp strategy throw, enough mud to cloud the water so the jury can't see the bottom. Then came the money moves. My legal team, which now included a shark of a lawyer Marla knew, anticipated this. We caught them attempting to liquidate offshore accounts and move assets into trusts under my aunt's name. We filed emergency injunctions freezing their accounts. For the first time in their lives, Richard and Celeste Parker reached for their wallets and found nothing but ice. The emotional counterattack was more personal. A few days after the arraignment hearing, I ran into my mother in the courthouse hallway. Her lawyer was distracted arguing with a clerk, and she saw her opening. She didn't look like the imperious matriarch of the gala. She looked small, pale, and trembling with a rage that vibrated in the air between us. She cornered me near the water fountains, her eyes wet with those weaponized tears. "You're happy now, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice a hiss. "You're killing this family, Vivian. You're destroying everything we built for you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized the cord was finally cut. "I didn't kill this family," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You killed it. I just stopped pretending it was still alive." She recoiled as if I'd slapped her, and I walked away before she could reply. The fallout with Ethan was more complicated. He didn't show up to the initial hearings. He went dark. I heard through the grapevine that he was staying in a hotel downtown, avoiding both me and our parents. I wanted to hate him for his silence, but I knew the math he was doing in his head. He was realizing that his entire adult life, his startup, his car, his engagement ring was funded by money stolen from his sister. He had to choose: protect the parents who bought him that life and keep the Golden Boy story intact, or tell the truth and lose his identity. He came to my apartment a week later. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His arm was still in a sling, and he stood in my doorway shifting his weight like a stranger. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there and apologized. It was an imperfect apology. He said he didn't know about the theft, which was true, but he also admitted that he never asked where the money came from because he didn't want to know. "I just wanted everyone to get along," he said, staring at his shoes. "I thought if I just kept the peace, it would be okay." "Peace cost me my freedom, Ethan," I told him. I didn't invite him in for coffee. I didn't hug him and tell him it was all okay. Because this isn't a fairy tale where forgiveness is cheap. It's accountability. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I can't carry you anymore." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and walked back down the hallway. It was the first honest interaction we'd had in a decade. Then there was Maddie. I expected her to hate me for ruining her wedding, but I underestimated her. Maddie Hale was smart, and she had dignity. She stepped back from the engagement quietly. It wasn't a dramatic, screaming breakup. It was a surgical removal. She met me for coffee, not to be friends, but to close the loop. She looked tired, but clear-eyed. "I loved him," she said, stirring her black coffee. "But I'm not marrying into a machine that eats daughters. I saw what they did to you, Vivian, and I realized, eventually, they'd do it to me." Her choice reinforced something I had almost forgotten in the chaos. Personal freedom is a value worth wrecking a party for. She walked away from the Parker money and the Parker influence because she preferred to own herself. I respected that more than I could say. But the victory, such as it was, took a toll on me. You don't spend years being gaslit and then just wake up fine the next day. I developed sleep problems. I'd wake up at 300 a.m. heart racing, convinced I heard sirens or the sound of a car engine revving. I became hypervigilant. Every time a car slowed down near me on the street, my muscles tensed. The grief hit me late, usually in the quiet hours of the morning. I wasn't just grieving the money or the years lost. I was grieving the family I kept hoping would change. There's a specific kind of pain in realizing your parents didn't love you enough to stop hurting you. I also experienced guilt. Heavy, irrational guilt, because exposing them had hurt Ethan too. It had blown up his life. Noah was the one who pulled me out of that spiral. We were sitting on my fire escape one evening watching the city lights, and I confessed that I felt like the bad guy. "Guilt isn't proof you're wrong, Viv," he said, handing me a beer. "It's proof you're human. They don't feel guilt. That's the difference." As the weeks passed, something shifted in the community. It started small. A local contractor who had been stiffed by my father on a renovation job years ago contacted my lawyer. Then a former housekeeper who had been fired and intimidated into silence came forward. Then a representative from a local charity my mother had manipulated. People who had been quietly harmed by the Parkers started speaking up. I became a symbol unintentionally. I wasn't the perfect victim. I was messy. I was angry. I had a record of being difficult. But I was a real person who refused to be erased. The narrative in town began to pivot. I wasn't the crazy daughter anymore. I was the one who broke the code of silence. Practically, the wheels of justice began to gain traction. The forensic accountant Marla brought in traced the flow of funds with terrifying precision. We saw the transfers from my grandmother's trust to the shell company, then to the contractors, the dealership, the campaign funds. The paper trail was undeniable. The civil suit for restitution began, and because of the injunctions, there was actually money to recover. The criminal investigation escalated with the DA adding charges as more witnesses came forward. The story stayed logical. We didn't rely on magic. We relied on the fact that greedy people eventually leave a receipt. The section ends on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I came home from a double shift at my new job. I had been reinstated, but I quit to work somewhere that didn't know my last name to find a simple envelope in my mailbox. It was from the forensic accounting firm. I sat on my floor still in my work uniform and opened it. It was a confirmation. They had successfully clawed back a significant portion of the trust assets. It wasn't everything my parents had burned through millions living a lie, but it was enough. It was enough to pay off my debts, enough to buy a house with a door that locked properly, enough to never be afraid of rent again. It wasn't a miracle, it was math. But as I held the letter, I didn't cry because I was rich. I cried because of what the money represented. For 10 years, they had told me I was incompetent, that I couldn't manage my own life, that I needed them to survive. They had stolen my safety to buy their luxury. I looked at the number on the page, and for the first time the voice in my head that sounded like my mother went silent. I wasn't insane. I wasn't unstable. I was targeted, and I had survived them. The end of the Parker dynasty didn't happen with a bang, but with the quiet, suffocating rustle of paperwork. Justice, I learned, isn't a gavel slamming down. It's a series of meetings in beige conference rooms where rich people try to buy their way out of consequences until they run out of currency. Richard Parker, the man who had terrified boardrooms and controlled town councils with a raised eyebrow, took a plea deal. Facing a laundry list of charges that included wire fraud, embezzlement, and the particularly damning count of elder exploitation, he chose to plead guilty to a reduced set of financial crimes to avoid a public trial that would have aired every dirty secret he had ever kept. He was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security federal facility, followed by hefty restitution. It wasn't a life sentence, but for a man whose entire identity was built on being untouchable, being a number in a system was a fate worse than death. Celeste didn't fare much better. She avoided prison time by turning state's witness against the accountant who helped them cook the books, painting herself as the naive wife who just signed where she was told. It was one last performance, one final manipulation. She got probation and community service, but the social gavel fell harder on her than the legal one. In Oakhaven, where reputation is oxygen, she suffocated. She was scrubbed from charity boards, uninvited from galas, and ignored in the grocery store aisle. The sheriff, Dana Klein, quietly resigned 2 weeks after the investigation went public. There was no press conference, just a brief statement about pursuing other opportunities and an internal review that would likely never see the light of day. It was the kind of soft landing power arranges for itself, but everyone knew the truth. She had bet on the wrong horse, and she had lost her badge for it. The estate, the physical manifestation of their lies, was seized to pay the restitution. I drove past it a month after the sentencing. The iron gates were chained shut, and a for sale by auction sign was zip-tied to the pillars. The landscaping crew had been let go, and the pristine lawns were already looking shaggy, the hydrangeas wilting in the heat. It looked like what it was, a house built on sand. My name was formally cleared. The charges of reckless endangerment and attempted assault were dismissed with prejudice, but the scar remained. I was no longer the crazy daughter, but I wasn't exactly a hero either. I was the woman who sent her father to prison. People still whispered when I walked into a coffee shop. They looked for cracks in my armor, wondering if maybe, just maybe, I was as cold as my father said. But the difference was, I no longer cared. I wasn't living for their approval anymore. The hardest part of the aftermath was Ethan. We didn't become best friends overnight. There was too much wreckage between us for that. He was living in a small apartment in the city, working a mid-level sales job because his startup had collapsed once the stolen funding was clawed back. We met for lunch at a diner halfway between our places' neutral ground. He looked different. The golden boy shine was gone, replaced by a weary caution. He looked like an adult for the first time in his life. I miss them sometimes. He admitted, picking at his fries. He didn't look at me when he said it. Is that messed up? No, I said, stirring my tea. They were your parents. They treated you like a prince. It makes sense you miss the kingdom. They treated me like a pet, Viv, he corrected, looking up. I see that now. They kept me fed and happy so I wouldn't bark. He took a breath. I really didn't want to believe it. When you were arrested, it was easier to think you were having an episode, because if you weren't crazy, then they were evil, and I couldn't handle that. That's what they counted on, I told him gently. They banked on your comfort being stronger than your curiosity, and for a long time it was. He flinched, but he didn't argue. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you sooner. I accept your apology, I said, but we have to have ground rules. I'm not going to be the keeper of the family secrets anymore, and I'm not going to be the person you vent to about how hard it is to be normal. We build this new relationship on truth, or we don't build it at all. He nodded, a small, sad smile touching his lips. Deal. It wasn't a perfect ending. We weren't hugging and crying, but it was real. It was a relationship based on who we actually were, not the roles we had been assigned at birth. Then there was the money. The restitution check, when it finally cleared, was substantial. It wasn't buy an island money, but it was change your life money. I sat with it for a week, terrified to touch it, feeling like it was cursed. But then I remembered my grandmother. She hadn't left this to me so I could be afraid. She left it to me so I could be free. I paid off my student loans. I fixed the dent in my car's bumper, not buying a new one, just fixing the one I had because I liked that car. I paid off my credit cards. And then I did something that would have made Richard Parker roll in his cell. I took a chunk of the money that had bought their influence, their silence, their fake respectability, and I started a grant. I set up a fund for legal aid in Oak Haven, specifically for families fighting custodial and financial abuse. I named it after my grandmother. It wasn't about prestige, it was about making sure the next time someone like Noah needed to fight a Goliath, they had a slightly bigger stone to throw. I chose community over the high walls my parents had built. I kept my job, though I cut back my hours to volunteer. I stayed in my apartment for a while, then eventually bought a small house with a porch and a garden I had to weed myself. I built a life that was small, messy, and entirely mine. 6 months after the gala, I returned to the vineyard one last time. The property had been sold to a tech mogul from the city, but the transfer hadn't closed yet, so it sat in a state of limbo. The gate was locked, but Graham, who had been hired by the bank to keep an eye on the place, let me in. You sure you want to be here? He asked, unlocking the side gate. Just need to check something, I said. I walked the gravel path alone. The tent was long gone, the debris cleared away. The spot where the convertible had smashed into the beam was just a patch of disturbed earth and new grass. It was quiet. No string quartet, no clinking glasses, no drone buzzing overhead. Just the wind in the vines and the distant sound of the highway. I walked to the spot where I had knelt that night. I remembered the zip ties cutting into my wrists. I remembered the smell of crushed hydrangeas and the look on my mother's face, that look of relief that she had finally discarded me. I stood there for a long time, waiting for the panic to come back. I waited for the shame, the fear, the feeling of being small. But nothing came. The silence wasn't menacing. It was peaceful. The vines didn't care who owned them. The sun didn't care about trust funds or grand larcenies. I realized then that my revenge hadn't been the gala or the documents or the police cars. My revenge wasn't seeing my father in a jumpsuit or my mother socially exiled. Those were just corrections, the consequences of gravity. My true revenge was standing here on the ground where they tried to bury me and feeling absolutely nothing for them. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was just finished. They had stolen my money. They had tried to steal my story. They had spent 20 years trying to convince me that I was broken so they wouldn't have to admit they were the ones holding the hammer. But the one thing they never understood, the one variable they left out of their equation, was the resilience of the truth. I looked out at the rows of vines stretching away in perfect geometric lines toward the hills. They were beautiful, but they were also acacia roots forced to grow in a straight line, pruned to produce a specific yield. I turned around and walked back toward the gate. I walked past the spot where the valet had sneered at my car. I walked past the spot where my mother had hugged me for the cameras. I walked out the gate where Graham was waiting to lock up behind me. "You good?" he asked, snapping the padlock shut. "Yeah," I said, getting into my car. The engine started with a reliable hum. "I'm good." I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to see the house shrinking in the distance to know it was behind me. I had stopped asking permission to live. And for the first time in my life, the road ahead wasn't something I had to run from. It was just a road, and I could go anywhere I wanted. And so, with the final act of defiance complete, Vivian Parker finally reclaimed her identity, leaving the toxic ashes of her past behind her. If you found yourself rooting for Vivian, let us know in the comments below what you thought was the Parker's most unforgivable move. We read every single comment of your thoughts. If you want more stories of justice and revenge, be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Yesterday. We'll see you next time.